Well, good afternoon, everyone. Lovely day. Nice to see you all. Looks like we have a fairly good balanced congregation, and nice to see all those at the back. You know, I would never pay more than £5 for a haircut. And that includes the tip. Well, I needed a haircut a few weeks ago, and I was walking down West Street in the city of Sheffield, and you know, you can see yourselves in the windows. You know, some people like to have a look at themselves, and I could see this mass of white hair, and I thought, I really have to get this sorted out. And I saw a barber's pole just a bit further along the road. You know the pole, it's a bit like my tie, and it's red and white. So I thought, barbers. So I walked past, I looked at the price list, haircut, £8. So I thought, well. Now I looked inside, and the chair was empty, and the barber was standing there looking hopeful. So I thought, okay, this is it, this is the time. So I went in and sat in the chair, and he fussed around like barbers do, you know. And I gave him his instructions. Now, I don't generally talk to barbers. I like them to concentrate on what they're doing with those very long scissors around, my vulnerable parts here. But he began immediately. Do you live around here? So I said, no. Well, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm visiting relatives. And he said, yes, he was a Turkish barber. He says, yes, he said, my relatives in Turkey. He said, I really love my mother. I thought, that's rather nice. And I really love my father and my brothers and sisters. I just love my family. So I began to feel a stirring inside. And do you know what was happening? This sermon was being born. And he waxed on about his family. I thought, this is, wonderful. And then, to crown it all, he leaned across with his hand. Now he's on this side of me, and he leaned across with his arm to kind of attack a bit of a tuft up this corner here. And as he did, I could read his arm. Now, it's covered in tattoos. And along this arm, in tall script writing, was, I love my family. And I thought, this man is not only full of his family, it's written all over him. And I thought, well, this is amazing. This is quite amazing to sit and listen to this young man. He wasn't married, but it was his mother's and his father's and his brothers and his sisters. I had my haircut. A few weeks later, I opened the Daily Mail, Monday the 4th of June. And the headline on this page was, you might have seen that, you might recognize it, Fury at top family court judge who said we should applaud the end of the nuclear family. And further down in it, it says, at a time when we have the highest rates of family instability in the entire developed world, precisely because of a trend away from relatively stable marriage, this is like saying that we should welcome and applaud the existence of ill health or broken legs. It continues a little bit. Yes, we must care for, support and treat and prevent brokenness. But to welcome and applaud it is a rare lapse of judgment. And of course, inside the paper, there were other comments being made, and this is the editorial from the Daily Mail, which is entitled Flawed Judgment. It says, there is a huge body of research showing that children brought up in a nuclear family are more secure, do better at school, enjoy better health than those who aren't. Family breakups also cost taxpayers up to £50 billion a year, including benefits. So how can one of our most senior family judges welcome and applaud the collapse of the traditional family unit in recent decades? Yes, we may reluctantly accept the rise in broken families and of course have enormous sympathy for the children. But to welcome the decline of such a fundamental and beneficial institution is simply perverse. So there's two, you might say, contrasting impressions that I gained in the last few weeks. And of course the church has for years and years and decades warned of the breakdown of family and has supported family in the church and has, you've heard many, I'm sure, many sermons and read many articles about the family. So my purpose this afternoon is threefold. Number one, how the family came into being. Now that's fundamental, but we'll just briefly look at that. And number two, the human family has a limited existence. It has a shelf life. The human family will not continue forever. And thirdly, now, in the present, the family is of great value. Title of this sermon, Family Life, brackets, rest in peace, question, R.I.P., question mark. Well, first point, God did design and create the human family. It's good to go to the source rather than discuss human opinions. Let's go to Matthew 19 and see what Jesus said about going to the source. Matthew chapter 19 for our first scripture. Matthew 19, and we can pick up the context here, where in verse 1 it says, "It came to pass that when Jesus had finished these sayings, he departed from Galilee. In verse 2, great multitudes followed him, and he healed them. And in verse 3, the Pharisees also came unto him," this is Matthew 19, verse 3, saying, "Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause?" So the subject was divorce. It was the customs that they were questioning him about, and so on. But Jesus didn't enter into the discussion of those customs. He said in verse 8, Matthew 19, he said unto them, "Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, suffered you to put away your wives. But," notice this, "from the beginning it was not so." So there may have been customs and so on about this particular subject that we're not pursuing. But Jesus went back to the beginning. He said, look, in the beginning, that's not what it was all about. It was not so. So let's look at the beginning that Jesus is referring to. Again, briefly, at the creation. Some people say two creations in the beginning. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 1 and see what Jesus would want us to understand. Instead of going through customs and traditions of men, we go back and look at the beginning regarding the family. Genesis chapter 1, verses 27 and 28. Now this is the big picture of creation. Some people say this is creation number 1, and then in chapter 2 we've got another creation. Well, that's just one is the big picture and the second is the detail. That's really all that is. In Genesis 1, verses 26 and 27, it says, beginning in 26, "And God said, let us make man in our image and after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air and over the cattle and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them." So here we have the overall big picture of creation. Now eventually God intends, and he did at that time, intended to put all the creation under man, and eventually intends to put everything under man. We won't turn to these various scriptures. It's nice to pop off and look at other accounts, but in Psalm 8 and Hebrews 2, you will find, if you read those verses in Hebrews 8 and verse 2, that God intended everything, not just the animals and the creation. That was immediately Adam and Eve's responsibility, and of course down through the ages it's been mankind's responsibility to care for the world around us. But there's a lot more in the story than that, and you can follow that through in Psalm 8 and Hebrews 10. And then in Genesis 2 we get the fine detail of this. In Genesis chapter 2 and verse 18, Genesis 2 verse 18, the Lord God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone." So the creation of Adam and Eve was in stages. First Adam was created, and Adam was around a bit. We don't know how long, but he was around a bit, naming the animals. And God said, well, it's not good that he's going to be alone. And there's two reasons. There's two things that is missing, two things that are missing from Adam. And he said, I will make, in verse 18, a help meet or fitting for him. Out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and so on, and he brought them to Adam for him to name them. Verse 20, he gave names to all the cattle and so on, but at the end of verse 20, Adam did not find a help amongst the animal world. And in verse 21, the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept, and he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh instead thereof, and the rib which the Lord God had taken from the man made he a woman and brought her to him. So Eve literally came out of the man, and God remolded that piece of material into a woman. It's amazing, isn't it? All the detail, all the what's inside us all the detail. He molded all that from the rib, brought it back to Adam, back to his side. See, that's significant. It was a rib from the side, and she came back to his side. He didn't take a finger bone or any other piece. It was a rib from his side. And then he brought her back to him. And a little bit more here. And the rib, which we read that, and Adam said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. Verse 23. And she shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and there shall be one flesh. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and they were not ashamed. So here we get the fine detail of the creation of the man and woman. Not yet the family, but the man and the woman. And then if we drop down to chapter 4, we can see the family beginning to come along. Moving now into family relations. Genesis 4 verses 1 and 2. It says, Adam and Eve, his wife, she conceived and bare Cain. So he was the first, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. And in verse 2 it says, she bare his brother Abel. Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. So here we now have what is called the nuclear family. Mother, father, 2 children. They used to have a statistic, was it 2.6 children on average or something like that? I seem to remember, in an average in the Western world or in Britain, or perhaps that was America. But anyway, here is the beginnings of the nuclear family, the beginning of family relations. And Adam needed a wife, so he now has a wife. Both of them ultimately will need the Spirit of God, but that's following another story. We know all about that. Now there are, of course, little debates about how many children Adam and Eve had. And all you can say for absolute certain is that they had 7 children. Because later on, 130 years later, another son comes along called Seth, and then it says, and beyond that they had sons and daughters. So they had at least 2 more sons and 2 more daughters. So that's Cain, Abel, Seth, 2 more sons, 2 more daughters, 7. So the commentators say, well, they had 7 children. Well, that's rather probably a bit slightly conservative. They lived for 900 years about. Now, how many children do you think families can have? I don't know if you saw this picture in the newspaper recently. This is in the Daily Mail, May the 30th, not too long ago. And this is Britain's biggest family, all from one mum and one dad, 20 children. Did you see that? One more on the way. There's one more on the way for this lady. I mean, I don't know, she's 40, no, he's 46. I can't see what age she was. But anyway, there you go. So that's how many in this world it's possible to have all those children. So there is at least 21 years of work gone into that family. And Adam and Eve lived for nearly 900 years. So who knows how many children eventually they had. They'll all pop up one day and we'll all meet them in the resurrection. According to the Josephus, who has a footnote in the works of Josephus, it says traditionally they had 33 sons and 23 daughters. That's according to tradition. Well, we'll just return to Cain and Abel in a little while. But let's move on to the point number 2. Here we have the launching of the family, the traditional family. But the human family has a shelf life. It will not last forever. Now, naturally and biologically, there's no reason why it shouldn't last forever, is there? You know, people can keep begetting and begetting and begetting, and there's no end necessarily to that. But again, we go back to what Jesus said in Luke chapter 20. Let's go back to Luke 20 and see that there is an end to the human family. It has a limited time. Luke chapter 20, and we'll look at verse 27. Luke 20, verse 27. It says, there came unto him certain of the Sadducees, which deny that there is any resurrection. So this is the topic, all about the resurrection. And dropping down to verse 34, Jesus said to them, again, he's going back to the basics, he's going back to the scriptures. Jesus answered and said unto them, the children of this world marry and are given in marriage. But they which shall be accounted worthy to obtain that world and the resurrection from the dead, neither marry or are given in marriage. So there is an end to the human process of marriage, and that will be after the resurrection. And there will be a time when all have gone through the resurrection, and then that will be the end of the human experience. So it has an end. So it had a beginning, the creation. We don't know when the end of that will be. We will find out when time comes. So that was another debate of Jesus. It was about the resurrection, that's our subject. But again, he takes them back to the scriptures and says, you don't know what you're talking about. Took them back to the scriptures of the resurrection and taught them that the family has a limited existence. The physical will give way to the spiritual. And the spiritual is of immense value to us. We have, in fact, this spiritual treasure right now in earthen vessels. That's the guarantee of our future life. So, getting to point number 3. So, what is the value of family life now, while we have it now? Some think it ought to pass away, some want to do this with it, some make all these comments about the modern family and so on. The word family is from the Latin familia, which means household. That's what a family is, it's a household. In the olden days, the household was much more than our present concept of the household. It's now really come down to a few people, maybe in the house, growing up and leaving the house and so on. But in the older generations, it would comprise of relatives of all different generations. It would also sometimes include servants. They would be a part of the household. You will remember Abraham's servant, Eliezer. Now, Eliezer was the heir to Abraham's estate. When God was promising Abraham and Sarah an offspring, Abraham was puzzled, of course, about that. And he said, well, this is my servant here, Eliezer. He is my heir. So a servant could actually have that role, enter into the family in that way. And we don't know much about Eliezer, what he thought, but he did have to realize eventually that he was not going to be the heir. I wonder how I think he had a very good attitude. I think he was a faithful man. It's likely that he was the servant that Abraham sent to find a wife for Isaac. It doesn't name him there as Eliezer, but commentators think it's very likely he's the same man. And of course he was very faithful and diligent in finding a wife for this son now who had replaced him as the heir. So he obviously had a good attitude towards that and was a faithful servant, trustworthy servant. Now the roles of each family, all the roles in a family will be different, but a common point is this: everyone in a family is on the same road, which I mentioned earlier, which is the road through the conversion and into the kingdom of God. And on that road, everyone in the family has got something to learn from each other. Whether it's mothers, fathers, grandmothers, grandfathers, nephews, nieces, all that might be considered in your family, all have something to learn from each other. Now I want to just pinpoint one person in the family. And the one person in the family is the newborn baby. We hear the announcement, a baby has been born. So there's an established family, all the relatives and you know, maybe 3 or sometimes 4 generations of people. And the announcement goes out, perhaps it gets read out in church. A baby is born, the newest member. And from the first second of the baby's birth, it is totally pristine. It has no influence. It has no understanding of what's happening. In fact, God designed the human baby to be so vulnerable that if it was left on a blanket and not looked at, it would die eventually. Unlike practically all other creatures in the natural world, all come with a survival kit built in. Animals get on their feet, they start to look for where the food is. You know, they're becoming very quickly independent. Some are a little bit more vulnerable than others, of course, and need, and God designed particular characteristics in animals that would demonstrate care and all of that. But the baby, totally vulnerable from the first second. But after that first second, the baby enters a very steep learning curve. From the first second, the first influence of the baby is the mother, and then the family environment. I have another clipping here. You won't be able to see this very well, but never mind. If I can find where I put it. It's a cartoon. I shall have to tell you about it. Here it is. It's also from the Daily Mail. You might be able to see that. But it's a family scene. And all the children and the dad look rather a bit overfed. And dad's carving into a large pizza, and the children are around the table with plates of chips, and they're eating chips. And there's food piled up. And coming in through the door is mother. And she looks rather well fed as well. You can probably see mother. And the caption is, "Yoo-hoo family, Mummy's home from hospital with our new baby, fill her up." Rather sad, isn't it, really? But this is humour, satirical humour. So that's the environment that a baby may enter into. And a child, it says, will process most of its life's data. You think of the data that pours in from all the media and so on. A baby will process most of its lifetime's data in its first year. It's pretty staggering, isn't it? Cries to be fed immediately. and eventually learns that every time it's picked up, food is near. That's a fundamental thing that it will learn. As soon as somebody picks it up, stops crying, food is near. The baby will begin to imitate human role models for good and evil immediately. What else is there to imitate? The models of the family. These are powerful and intense influences. And this year's worth of data that we absorb as the first year of a baby will follow us all through our life. Isn't that staggering? You think of the influence. Now in Genesis chapter 4, let's just pop back there and look at Cain and Abel because it's a familiar story. But go back to Genesis chapter 4 and in verse 1 again, we'll just read that. And Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain, Genesis 4 verse 1, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. And we know the story. Cain killed his brother. I mean, seems like only two of them on earth with Adam and Eve, or it's very, couldn't have a smaller unit, and yet one kills the other. Where was the influence? Could only be Adam and Eve's influence. And of course, we know Satan is the god of this world, so we mustn't neglect that, of course. That's in the mix as well. In verse 8 it says, and Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him. Now God did not let Cain off the hook and say, well, never mind, it was your environment that did it. In verse 7 back it says, God is speaking here, if you do well, shall you not be accepted? If you do not well, sin lies at the door, and unto you shall be its desire, but you ought to rule over it. So God did give Cain responsibility. He had some responsibility in this. But when we see how small the family unit was, then all the influences were coming down from that small unit into these children that have been born. The newborn baby, when it comes into this world, has not got the data to honour its parents. This is a serious business, honouring parents. The newborn baby hasn't got that data immediately. It has to be learned. And the parents are the teachers. So there's some data does not come automatically, it has to be given, it has to be taught. Particularly this one that we want to focus on, honouring parents. It has to be learned. All the family must support this teaching of honouring parents. Try and picture the family. Little baby's arrived, there's mum and dad, and there's all the aunts and so on around, and the grandparents. All of them are responsible for teaching this little baby to honour its parents. That is so important. It's one of the great laws of God, to honour parents. Puts it that way around. Looking upwards to God, looking upwards to the parents and giving them honour. Listen to this quotation from a psychiatrist called Joseph Noshpitz. He was founder and president of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. And he wrote 6 books in 6 volumes of a handbook on child psychiatry. This is what he said. Listen to this. Children learn their morality and ethics by taking in the model that the parents set before them. The very little ones, the babies he means, learn by imitation. They suck up behaviour like vacuum cleaners, taking in the dross with the gold. They can't discern or analyse as we later can, but they just take it all in. The parental problems side by side with their virtues. They take it all in. Problems and virtues. It's not just what we tell them to believe that gets built in. It's the total experience of mum and dad. You probably heard the simple little joke at the dinner table. Junior says to his dad, "Dad, pass the butter." So Junior says, "Okay, Dad, pass the butter." And Dad says, "That's better." That really sums up how we influence our children. No? Another saying, "Don't do as I say, don't do as I do as I say. Don't follow my example, but do what I say." It doesn't work. It doesn't work because actions speak louder than words. So this is the purpose of family life, and we're looking at now the first commandment. Let's look at the first commandment. It's called in the New Testament the first commandment with promise. Let's turn back to Peter. We'll go to Ephesians chapter 6. Ephesians chapter 6. And see what Paul presents us here with one of the commandments. Ephesians chapter 6. And in verse 2. Well, verse 1. "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise." And immediately we should ask in our minds, what's the promise that's been stated here? What is the promise that comes? Well, verse 3. "That it may be well with you, and that you may live long on the earth." That's the promise. In the Old Testament, let's go back to the commandments. In Exodus 20, I'm sure you will remember those. Exodus chapter 20. It's the fifth commandment. And in Exodus chapter 20, and in the fifth commandment, is in verse 12. It says, "Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God gives you." So this is the land of promise. But when Paul quotes it in Ephesians 6, it says that it may be well with you, that you may live long on the earth. So the promise is extended now. In the commandments in the Old Testament, it was to live long in the land. And of course, there are promises with the other commandments, but this is very specific. There is a promise with, for example, the second commandment, where it says, "You shall not make graven images," in verse 4 of Exodus 20, and so on. Verse 5, "You shall not bow down yourself to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God," and so on. In verse 6, "Showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments." So there's a promise. Mercy to all those who keep God's commandments, but this is a specific promise of living long on the earth. So honouring parents is linked with living long on the earth. Now, honouring not only includes obedience, but requires admiration, respect, and even reverence. This quality must be within one's heart, not just mechanical obedience. Honouring is something that usually does not happen in a child until maturity. Children grow up learning obedience. And then it develops into honouring. This young barber, Turkish barber, he was probably in his 20s, maybe early 20s. He was honouring his parent openly, as a young man who respected and understood how much his parents meant for him. Obedience to parents as a child gets one started in the right direction and produces its own rewards. And the real rewards lie in the practice of honouring itself. And here's a point that's very important. Honouring our parents will transfer our spiritual attitude towards God in honouring our spiritual parents. Turn now to Deuteronomy chapter 6. Now Jesus talked about the commandments and he separated them into two. in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 to 9. You'll remember how Jesus quoted this in Matthew 22, when they asked him what was the great commandment. And he says the great commandment in verse 5, verse 4, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord." Verse 5, "And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words which I command you this day shall be in your heart." Now we've always understood that this is the first 4 commandments. Love towards God. And Jesus also added, and the second is like it, that you love your neighbour. We tend to think that's the other 6 commandments. But really the 5th one doesn't belong with neighbour. It belongs more with love towards God. Because learning to honour is a godly attribute. Learning to honour parents is a model of learning to honour God. So that's why it continues to say here after verse 6, "And you shall teach them diligently to your children." So here we get the 5th commandment, teaching things diligently to your children, "and shall talk with them when you sit in your house and when you walk by the way, when you lie down and when you rise up." So here's the influence on children as they're growing up, talking about the things of God, talking about God's ways and God's plan. And that's linked in with the first great commandment. Now some have suggested that the 5th commandment is a bridge between love towards God and love towards neighbour. Love towards neighbour is purely about those around us outside. And I should love my neighbour as I love myself, so I don't steal from him. I don't look at his wife. I don't lie or do any of those things. I don't murder and don't kill and so on. That's all love towards my neighbour. I should love my neighbour as myself. That's something. I don't want somebody to come and cheat on me. I don't want somebody to steal from me. So I'm not going to do that to them. That's love your neighbour as yourself. That's the 6. Love towards God, the first 4, but honouring parents right there in the middle. Now, it doesn't really matter if you think of that as a bridge between the two, which it is, or whether you think of honouring your parents as being more like a God-like quality, because it leads us to honour our Father in heaven. So we can look at those perhaps in these different ways. A 5-5 division or a 4-6 division, it doesn't really matter, or that it's a bridge. The 5th commandment is aimed directly at parental responsibility. That's its goal. It will be difficult to accomplish this goal with absent parents. So we do get tragedies in this world, one-parent families and so on, and they have to be cared for and looked after. It's difficult to accomplish this honouring of God if the parents do not know God at all. That's going to be difficult. Or if their knowledge of him is shallow and they are not practicing what they do know. What will they pass on to their children? Well, exactly the same. And that's the effect that family will have on their children. Ideally, both parents ought to be dedicated and deeply involved in honouring God in their own lives if their children are going to grow up and be prepared to perform the much more rewarding practice of honouring God. We've looked at some aspects of family life. All members contribute, especially the importance of the 5th commandment. Human society will indeed be poor if the traditional family structure is lost. My Turkish barber was an encouraging example of his appreciation of his own family. When he'd finished cutting my hair and I got off the chair, I offered him a £10 note. And you know what? He didn't have any change. So I said, keep the change. Because the experience in his chair was quite rewarding and fulfilling.